It's a delight to take part in this online seminar series. Just to check on timing, do we go till 1:10 or 1:15, or what's our timing like?
So yeah, 110 and then
Mhm.
5 minutes of question and answers. And would you like to receive questions during the talk, or do you prefer to answer the questions at the end of the talk?
If you read them out during the chat, I'd be happy to, and if I felt like I could address it there, I would. If I felt like it's better addressed at the end, I would just indicate that. So I don't mind having questions along the way, especially
Awesome.
clarification questions. Yeah.
Got it.
All
Awesome.
right. Great. So each morning when we wake and we sorry, oh yeah, each morning when we wake and we open our eyes, we get to re-experience what I like to call the scientific miracle of vision. It is vision that allows us to see objects and separate them from their backgrounds, to appreciate great works of art, whether abstract or more concrete in nature. And it's vision that allows us to solve the really hard problem of inference. To understand what it's like to see, you almost have to undo the process of vision, and it's so rapid and automatic, we can take it for granted. But if I present you this image rather than as pixels, but as a matrix of numbers, so 0 would represent the dark portions of the image, the higher numbers like 6, 7, and 8 would be the brighter portions. And I could even send this to everyone on the seminar as a simple matrix file and say, your task, without looking at it, is to figure out what's contained in this image. I think that would be an interesting and fairly challenging task, even for many of the coding experts in the audience. Now, when I change this into a matrix of pixel intensities, you may have an impression or a guess of what object it is. You may even have an impression of a face, or even have a good guess as to whose face that might be. Especially if you squint your eyes, it might look a little clearer. So that gives you a sense of the scientific and inferential nature of vision. Now, how is this miracle of vision achieved? We know that the human visual system is highly complex. About 25 to 30% of the human cortex is dedicated to vision, indicating it's willing to spend a lot of expensive cortical real estate on this problem. It consists of 30 plus visual areas. Signals go from the retina to the geniculate nucleus thalamus relay, and then onward to primary visual cortex, where you first see some interesting tuning properties for orientation, spatial frequency, binocular disparity, motion direction, and so forth. But then these motifs, these features get elaborated on, and you see more complex tuning properties as you move up the visual hierarchy. Whereas encode things such as curvature, texture, 3D properties, including properties of objects. And although we can readily identify objects by sight, we are more hard put to describe exactly what those properties are that allow us to attain the feats of recognition. Now, signals in the visual system travel from the eye to LGN to cortex and are processed with a very strong feed-forward sort of organization. But it's worth keeping in mind that each stage of the cortical hierarchy, there are lateral interactions, allowing for a form of recurrent processing, as well as there's top-down feedback to allow for perhaps cognitive modulation, top-down inference, and so forth. For today's talk, I'm mostly going to focus on feed-forward processing in CNNs and how they compare to the human visual system. Now, given the complexity of the human visual system, how might it ever be possible to understand or model it? Truth be told, when I started out in this field, and I audited a course or two in computer vision, the algorithms there were sometimes effective, certainly for things like 3D shapeform shading, motion energy, certain types of things. You could calculate things about depth using stereo, but object recognition was a really hard problem, and I never thought that we would get to the point we are today back then. Really, really transformational. And the advent of AlexNet and convolutional networks as a candidate image computable models of the primate visual system, I think, is a really interesting development in AI, and really actually helped forward the AI movement. And it was argued, after AlexNet was devised, and then subsequently VGG19, GoogleNet, ResNet, and so forth, that CNNs or DNNs, deep neural networks, appear to have achieved or surpassed human-level performance at object recognition. That was the claim. And concurrently, there were interesting claims in neuroscience showing that the representations learned by DNNs seem to correspond to a first approximation to those that are found in the non-human and human primate visual cortex. So these are all really interesting and tantalizing findings as my lab got interested in looking at this more closely. At first, I was skeptical about the claimed performance of DNNs. And I was wondering, have they truly reached human-level performance in object recognition tasks? So take the scenario here. Would you notice that there's an animal hiding in the bushes? Or I'm going to show you another image, and this will be, I think, more challenging. There's an interesting animal in this image. It may take you a while to find. And in fact, probably most of you, I would guess, don't see this animal in the scene. However, I give you a cognitive clue describing the animal. I think you'll do better. If I said it's a giraffe, I'd say maybe half of you can now find where the giraffe might be if you see it. And if you don't, I don't know if my mouse pointer will work. Does it work?
Yes, it works.
The giraffe is right here, hidden alongside this tree. And there are a variety of scenarios in everyday life, such as driving, or there are atmospheric conditions that can affect our ability to see and can severely impact the function of computer vision models. So these are relevant both from understanding biological vision and its efficacy, and for effective applications. And it's been found in a variety of studies that DNNs appear unusually brittle and often fail to recognize more challenging images. In fact, if you're familiar with it, the ImageNet-C database was created as a test of a way to evaluate the robustness of CNNs in general. We got interested in this problem back in around 2016, 17. Hojin Zhang, a grad student of mine at the time, is at MIT and is now assistant professor at Korea University. And our goal was to try to figure out, exactly how well these CNNs could there's actually an object hidden in here if you have a sense of something. And it's actually, if you have a sense of it, anyway, we'll go on to the next slide. So one thing I want to say about how I'm going to talk about these objects and noise, I'm going to call them the strength of the signal as a signal plus signal versus noise, the signal versus signal plus noise ratio. And so using the simple formula rather than the standard SNR formula, if an image contains pure signal, it would have a value of 1. If it's pure noise, a value of 0. If it's half signal, half noise, it would be 0.5. For this task, we can compare humans and CNNs. We had 16 object categories. 8 were animate objects, 8 were inanimate objects. And we could present the objects at various SS and R levels from 0.05 to 1 and see how they do. And the human would perform a 6 alternative identification task. So this is a very, very noisy object image. If any of you can see anything in here, come see me. Your brain is extraordinary, and we want to test it. Same thing here at 0.1. I think no human nor even CNN could find anything here. Now, at 0.15, there actually is a tiny, tiny bit of structure that starts to emerge, but probably none of you can recognize this at this point. Maybe a few of you, a handful will at 0.2. This gives you an impression. Again, you might see some structure, but you might not hazard a guess at an object. A few of you might, maybe occasionally a rare person will actually be able to identify the object at this point. Now I'm going to go up to 0.25. Now, some of you might be doing better. It's usually easier on the left than the right. I'm going to go up to 0.3. By this point, some of you, a good number of you should have recognized the object on the left, but maybe not all of you. And I'm going to go up to 0.54 if you see it. At this point, just about everyone can see the object on the left and the right. And I'll go further clear. Now I'm just going to, for fun, go back down. This is called hysteresis. You might still feel you can see the object at noise levels that previously you were unable to. This is going back down to 0.4, 0.3, 0.2. You might still be able to see some Jeep structure. And this is, sorry, this is 0.2 here. Very difficult, but you might be able to see some structure still. So certainly there can be a top-down or more cognitive component to object recognition. But on the first instance, if we just flash that object briefly and you had to recognize it like we do with our participants, you may be relying primarily on feed-forward recognition processing. We evaluated a variety of CNNs listed here. and various steps of models and the humans. So I'm just going to jump to the initial results when we ran this first study. This is human performance shown in the black curves and the DNN performance average of those DNNs shown in red. And two things stand out. First, and this is the performance of each of the individual CNNs shown on the right. Now you can see the humans are doing much better than any of the deep neural networks that have so-called, including ResNet 152, which was so-called reached human level performance. But another thing is striking. The performance of the humans is qualitatively different than the DNNs. Humans do better at recognizing the objects in pixelated Gaussian noise, whereas the open symbols, that's the Fourier phase scramble noise, that's the cloud-like noise that you saw, they do worse with that. And for the CNNs, it's the opposite. So not only are the CNNs worse, they're processing information in a qualitatively different manner, in an alien-like manner, you could argue. If we look at 0.5 SSNR, humans are near ceiling. They're not perfect, but they're near ceiling. And the CNNs are, and those show example images at that SSNR level. And at 0.3 SSNR, they drop down to about 50% accuracy on a 16 classification task, where chance is, below 10%. Now, we can contrast that with the DNNs. DNNs are about 50% accuracy at the 0.5 SSNR, and they're at floor when you get down to 0.3 SSNR. So a stark difference in performance. Now, can DNNs learn to be more noise robust? I joked with my grad student at the time, like humans 1, machines 0. But then we said, well, can we make the DNNs, more robust? And at that time, there wasn't that much data augmentation being done with DNNs back in 2017. Oh, and in spirit of full disclosure, we have a patent on noise training DNNs to make them more robust. Yeah, I just thought I should mention that in full disclosure. So what we can do is we can train these DNNs on noise, and now they can do better. Two things to know. If you train them on one type of noise and you test it on another, there's minimal cross generalization. However, you can train a single DNN to be robust to both pixelated Gaussian noise and Fourier phase scramble noise, which for me is somewhat interesting, because if you think about these two types of noise, they are almost polar opposites. Pixelated noise is spatially uncorrelated noise, would be another way to describe it mathematically, and Fourier phase scrambled noise has a lot of spatial structure. Another thing you can notice, the noise trained DNNs, now they're performing better with Gaussian noise than with Fourier phase scrambled noise. We don't know if these networks are performing optimally, but they're certainly much better, and they're doing better than humans. And when they achieve these, superhuman levels, and I'll show that it is indeed superhuman. So we can indicate the threshold SSNR level at which humans or CNNs reach 50% accuracy on the 16 AFC task. That's indicated here. Further to the left means better performance. Red shows the performance of our pre-trained neural networks. They're all doing much worse than the humans, but the noise-trained VGG19 does better than all 20 humans that we tested in this study. So the noise-trained DNNs can outperform humans at recognizing noisy objects, but more interestingly, from our perspective, is their performance is more qualitatively similar to humans across noise types. Now, how does noise training alter the representations and noise robustness of the hierarchical DNNs? We performed a layer-specific sensitivity analysis, and I'll describe to you how we did this. We can create a noised image with varying SSNR level, and we can also present noise-free versions of that exact same image. And then in each layer, we can look at the evoked CNN activity patterns across the entire layer and correlate their similarity, or use correlation, Pearson correlation, to calculate the similarity of the responses. And if the response to a very, very noisy image is more similar to the clear image, then that would be an indication that the representation is more stable or robust to noise. Now we can identify the SSNR threshold at which this correlation reaches 0.5. And so we can get a metric of when the correspondence is fairly decent, and thus the lower the SSNR threshold, the more noise robust a given layer is to noise. Hopefully that's clear. This shows the results of that analysis. And you see two things going on in this graph over here. First, standard DNNs are not noise robust, And as information propagates across successive layers, you see sort of a magnification or a certain degree of amplification of susceptibility to noise, especially in the later layers of the DNN. By contrast, the noise-trained DNN is actually able to achieve a more robust stability to noise across successive layers. So in effect, the representation, as it's becoming more complex and more tuned to object properties, it's also becoming more noise robust. In effect, a type of denoising is possible. And that actually sort of makes sense because with Gaussian noise, it's spatially uncorrelated. So if you pool the information in an appropriate manner, you should be able to mitigate the effects of that local noise that's happening in this sort of randomized way. You see a different pattern of results for Fourier phase scrambled noise. Now here you can see that for standard DNNs, the effective noise, again, is amplified, in fact, dramatically amplified across successive layers. And for the noise-trained DNNs, they don't show the reduction of SSNR threshold across successive layers, but they're able to maintain and hold the line that is maintain the same stable level of SSNR threshold across the successive layers. And that also sort of makes sense, I think, because the noise is spatially structured. It's hard to fully remove this structured noise, but you can be more robust to it after training the DNN. Now, if anyone has ideas for how one can do further analyses to see exactly how these representations are changing as a result of this training from a more deeper mathematical perspective, I'd love to chat more about that and get your thoughts about that because it's, again, non-trivial to figure out how DNNs achieve something computationally, even though the networks do learn it through the process of supervised training. So we conducted a follow-up behavior study. We want to know about human alignment. And to do this, we wanted to be able to assess the critical SSNR threshold at which humans can recognize individual SSNR images. Now, this would be a little bit problematic if I showed 10 versions of the same image with different SSNR levels randomly ordered, because as you notice with the Jeep image, after you saw the clear version, it affected how well you could recognize the noisy versions. So for this study, we went from a perfectly noisy version of an image and gradually unveiled it and increased its SSNR level over time. Concurrently, we present sort of a tone that goes boop, 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 boop. And you're encouraged to hit a button as soon as you think you're confident as to what object category it is. If you press the button, you say, I'm ready to make a response. You then make your classification response. And if you're correct, you can earn more money. But if you're incorrect, you get nothing. And the faster you respond for correct responses, you get proportionally more money as a way to incentivize trying to respond sooner, but also correct.
One clarifying question, Frank. Here, is the noise also changing, or is the same noise and the magnitude is changing also?
It's the same noise, and the contrast ratio of signal to noise ratio is changing over time because we didn't want people to be able to average across different noise versions, because your brain can certainly do that, and that would be a bad way to design the study. Good question. So we can extract a couple interesting things from this study. We can extract whether they got it right or not, the SSNR threshold that they used to make their response. And afterwards, we'd have them do a painting task, I believe that's shown here, where they're asked to then paint the portions of the image that they use to rely on their classification response. Now they do 600 trials, 800 trials, 50 images for every category. And we can look at the correlation between standard CNNs or noise-trained CNNs and human thresholds. For every dot is an individual object image. And you can see that standard CNNs don't do a good job of predicting human thresholds, but the noise-trained DNNs do much better. So noise-trained CNNs provide a better model of human recognition thresholds of objects in noise. That said, there's still room for growth. We are not all the way to perfect human alignment. If we looked at the human-to-human correlation, and let's say we did a splitting the groups of humans into two halves, this is just off the top of my head, but that correlation is probably around 0.9 or close to it. So the CNNs are still, not doing things exactly like the way we do. We can look at the overlap of the regions used for the standard and noise-trained CNNs, and when presented with objects and noise, the standard CNNs start to focus on very unusual regions that are not diagnostic of the object, whereas the noise-trained DNN picks up on regions that overlap to a considerable degree with humans, and that's depicted over here in terms of the overlap ratio or correlation You see that the noise-trained DNNs are doing better. Again, there's still room for improvement to reach human level correspondence. So again, I think that this is interesting, sort of half full, half empty sort of thing in terms of the current status of CNNs and trying to get them to perform more like humans. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show how we compare the performance of DNNs or the response of DNNs to those of the human visual cortex and describe an analytic method. In this early paper by Nico Kriegescourt, he tried to look at the similarity between cortical responses in monkeys and humans. And the monkey neural data were actually quite different. There was responses of individual neurons, and he could look at the responses pooled across, say, 100 neurons and how similarly or differently they'd respond to images of, I don't know if you can see that, there'd be like faces, fruit, inanimate tools, a variety of stimuli. And what you can calculate is a Pearson correlation matrix of the similarity of the responses to each of these objects for the monkey and the human. And here he's plotting that as not a similarity matrix, but a dissimilarity matrix. You could do it either way, where the dissimilarity is 1 minus the Pearson correlation. So 0 would be perfect correlation here, and a value approaching 1 would mean totally dissimilar. Now, you can do this and say, how similar are the representations in the visual cortex of monkeys and humans? But you can do the same analysis comparing the responses, say, of human inferior temporal cortex and the responses in a convolutional network, looking at the layer-wise pattern of responses to each of the objects that the human sees. And if the representations are more similar, you will see a greater correlation when you compare those two matrices to one another. That R value will deviate from 0 and will move towards 1 as the similarity increases. One other side point about this analysis, usually before you do this correlation analysis, you will blank out the diagonal, the main diagonal, because that's going to be all just a bunch of 1s, and so it shouldn't be included. Hopefully that was clear. So the left panel will just show sort of an SVM analysis. I'll describe that, and then the right panel will be relying on the RSA analysis. So the left panel here, we're just looking at how well the human brain can, using the activity patterns from primary visual cortex, that's V1, V4 would be a higher early visual area beyond V1, and the visual area is named lateral occipital area, LOC, fusiform face area, parahippocampal place area. Those are high-level object-tuned areas. And in general, we see the best classification of what image the person was looking at using when they view clean or clear object images. It's intermediate for objects in Gaussian noise. And we presented objects at the same SSNR level for Fourier phase scrambled noise. That's where we see the worst performance. So that general trend is consistent with human performance, from better to worse to worst. But then we can also look at the layer-wise similarity. This is for VGG19, either standard VGG19 shown in red or noise-trained VGG19 shown in blue. And the correlational similarity of the response to the various objects and comparing that to the activity patterns we've seen in human V1, V2, V3, all the way up to the higher visual areas, LOC, FFA, and PPA. And you can see that in every case, the noise-trained DNN does better at predicting human cortical responses to objects in noise. Now, why is it that humans are, so robust to noise? There could be multiple factors. One factor that we think actually contributes to it, it's not like our brains are so well engineered or provide these very balanced responses that aren't susceptible to, the asymmetric effects of random, in particular Gaussian noise. We think learning could have a role. Again, it's tricky to compare the statistical properties of real-world noise to artificial noise. If people have ideas on this, I would love to hear them or talk further about this as well, because it's a real challenging. But one thing we did to try to sort of begin to approach this issue, we looked at vehicles, and we did a Google search to find vehicles in snow or rain or other noisy conditions, and we grabbed those from the internet using 8 vehicle categories that are also part of the ImageNet data set. And now what we can do is present these challenging images of vehicles to CNNs and see how they do. And what we found is that the standard CNNs shown in red do fine for the noise-free images, but perform worse for the noisy images. And in particular, if you sort the noisy images as a function of whether it's weak noise, medium noise, or strong noise, you see the greatest benefit for the medium and strong noise conditions. We suspect, although we haven't proven that, this is because there is some, partial, image statistical overlap between real-world noise and artificial noise methods of generating noise, even though the overlap is far from perfect. Again, it's not a proof, it's just sort of a suggestive piece of evidence. So the conclusion for this first study is that state-of-the-art CNNs trained on standard image sets lack robustness to noisy images and deviate from human vision, and that noise-trained CNNs provide a better match to human behavioral neural performance and can generalize to some extent to out-of-sample conditions, such as those real-world noisy object images. Let me just pause here a moment. If there are no questions, I'll continue on.
I have a quick question, Frank. This is fascinating. So the noise is generated randomly, right? In machine learning, we have adversarial noise as well. An equivalent of training with adversarial noise is referred to as adversarial training, right? So the idea is that given the inputs, the image is very high dimensional, being able to cover an area around an image, like adding these noises like a random walk around one image, and this random walk is not going to cover the entire space. So we would like to essentially find a noisy image that makes the performance of the network worse, right? And I wonder if this study is also applicable to this adversarial training setting where the noise is not random, but it's actually designed to make the performance of the model worse.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sohail. So a couple of things to mention. Adversarial training of CNNs does make them both more robust to noise and does improve to some degree the degree of alignment with human neural responses. So both are true. For these studies, we favored randomly generated noise because we didn't want to steer the CNN too much, and then also because, at least for Fourier phase scramble noise, it has sort of a naturalistic component, and so we thought that was interesting. But certainly adversarial training with noise does work, and if you train a CNN with the pixelated Gaussian noise, it does improve to a very modest extent robustness to adversarial noise, but it's not like a huge boost. It's like a modest boost. Yeah. So there's overlap in some of the learning, but we have not investigated in depth the degree of similarity, dissimilarity in depth across adversarial and random noise training.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, on the one hand, I do think we face noise in everyday conditions, but one thing that we felt was a little bit missing is that even without exposure to noise, we suspected that there could be some robustness due to other factors that we haven't thought more deeply about. And one component of vision that we think is lacking from ImageNet or from most web image databases is blur is undersampled. So when you're born, the eye is initially hyperopic, and then it grows to normal length. So everything actually is initially quite blurry for infants, especially things that are close up. And as they age, both development of the eye and to the central visual system, their acuity gets better across the first year or two of life. Another factor to consider is defocus blur, which happens for any lens-based optical system. As illustrated here, you can see that what looks like Yosemite, I think, looks out of focus in the distance, that mountain. And then another is the fact that this isn't exactly like blur, but peripheral vision is low spatial resolution, and our undersampling of the visual world as well as blur could, on the one hand, it presents challenges to our visual system, but those challenges could provide a type of training for our visual systems, which in theory could make it more robust. So I'm going to take you through two studies, one where we mimic sort of the developmental sequence of going from blurry to clearer vision as an infant would experience. And then in study 3, we'll talk about just more pervasive training with blur. So in this study, study 2, we trained CNNs initially with a blur level of images with a sigma of 8 pixels, and then it progresses to 4, 2, 1, and 0 would be clear. So no blurs applied with 0 sigma. And this is co-author, or first author, I should say, Hojin Zhang. And then we test it with faces of varying degrees of blur, including more severe levels of blur. You can see here with 32, a sigma of 32, you hardly even have an impression of a face. And this is recognition performance of faces for the clear trained CNNs. This is a 10 AFC, I believe, using faces from I believe it's VGG face, but I'd have to double check which face database we used for this, using 10 celebrity faces. And the clear CNNs are fine at recognizing clear faces, but they do very poorly at recognizing blurry faces. By contrast, the blurry to clear trained CNN does well at recognizing blurry faces. It maintains its ability to recognize blurry faces, and its performance maps on surprisingly well to human performance. This is accuracy as a function of blur level, shown on the x-axis. Now, you can contrast that with an object classification task. We're again using the 16 objects that I showed you in the earlier study. And here you see that both the clear trained CNN and blurry to clear trained CNN are horrible at recognizing blurry objects, whereas humans are much more robust to blur, shown in red. So there's a clear divergence between the benefits of blurry to clear training for the faces, for the CNNs, and the lack of any benefit when trained and tested with objects. By the way, just to be clear, these were separate CNNs that were trained on either the face task or the object recognition task. And I believe you can even train a single CNN on both faces and objects, and you see a similar divergence for those particular categories. Now, I'm showing here the performance as we peek into the performance of the network across successive stages of training. So this is where it's trained on a blur level of 8, and then we progress to 4. Here, when it's trained on a blur level 4, you see good generalization across a range of tested blur levels. And as we progress further to making the images clearer and clearer, you can see that there's a bit of loss of recognition at the blurriest level of a sigma of 8, but performance maintains quite well for intermediate blur levels from 0 to 4 pixels of for that standard deviation of the Gaussian kernel. And this can be contrasted with object recognition, where they're being trained on all 1,000 ImageNet categories. And then we test performance on the 16 categories at, say, a sigma of, this is sigma of 8. This is now testing after it's trained with a sigma of 4. You can see that performance shifts. It's best for a blur level of 4. It's lost its ability to recognize those blurry images that it previously could recognize. When we shift to a blur level of 2, it loses its ability to recognize a blur level 4, and so forth. So there's catastrophic forgetting happening here. So what's going on here? Why this catastrophic forgetting? We think it's because the best discriminating object information in these object images resides at higher spatial frequencies. And CNNs, with supervised training, they're greedy. They'll learn whatever they can to leverage better performance, but they will lose what they had before if by learning these better representations causes that loss. So this is I think sort of the slavish nature of CNN training. And you can even look at the layer 1 representations, and you can see how the learned kernels are going from lower spatial frequency to higher and higher and higher across successive stages of training, illustrated here from left to right. Now, this brings us to the third study where, we wanted to measure spatial frequency tuning in these trained networks. And here, just focusing on AlexNet, what we can do, what Hojin has done here is he's depicted the spatial frequency preference of individual feature maps in each layer of AlexNet, focusing on the convolutional layers. And what he did was he presented different sine wave grading patterns to AlexNet with varying numbers of cycles per stimulus, going from just one cycle all the way to 112 cycles, right? Because it's a 224 pixel image. And what you can see is that in the first stage, when they're trained on just blurry images, that's the light blue color here, most of the units sorted from preferring the lowest spatial frequencies to somewhat higher, they're all tuned to fairly low spatial frequencies. But as you progress to all the way to a blur level of 0, that spatial frequency preference is largely maintained across the successive layers. And the clear train networks shown in gray tend to prefer higher spatial frequencies on average, as indicated by the elevated nature of this gray bump over here that's prominent in layers 1 through 4. It's a little less prominent in layer 5, but you can clearly see it in layers 1 through 4. Now I'm going to switch to training with blurry to clear objects shown below. And you can see that across successive stages, going from orange to red to the sort of darkish brown, that across each stage, the spatial frequency tuning shifts in favor of higher spatial frequencies with each successive stage of training, where we're training on slightly clearer images. So again, you can visualize this bias as it's happening in the developmental sequence with these trained CNNs. So if the human brain is similarly plastic, and it's constantly being tuned to the visual environment, it's possible that just initial experiences with blur are inadequate for accounting for our continued robustness to blur. And this leads us to study 3, where we examine the impact of training, sustained training, or you could call it mixed training, on a combination of clear and blurry images. And we had 3 types of CNN training protocols. Standard CNNs train on clear images only. When I say clear images, by the way, the images themselves could contain some levels of blur. We just didn't add any blur to the images, to be clear. We had a weak blur condition where this was based on data collected from looking at human eye movements in real scenes and estimating the level of blur in the images that they looked at with their eyes using video-based camera recordings. And the majority of now we apply the frequency of blur. Again, this would be spatially across the whole thing, but we applied that frequency of blur so that most of the images are clear, shown with 0 sigma, a fairly moderate portions with 1 pixel of blur, less so with 2 pixels, all the way up to these very, very rare instances of a sigma of 5, happening just 0.2% of the time. And then for comparison, we had the strong blur condition where we provide equal frequency of these varying levels of blur. And we want to see how the CNNs process visual information after these types of training. And again, we're training a variety of different neural networks. The effects across all of them tend to be very similar. So we just average their tendencies for the purposes of these analyses. Although if you go to the paper, you can see some more specific ones that are provided. And this paper just recently came out in Nature Communications just a couple weeks ago. We're going to compare or assess human CNN alignment, looking at 2 human fMRI data sets and also 2 monkey neurophysiology data sets. And we're also going to look at generalization to challenging out of distribution conditions, looking at our fMRI study of objects in noise, and also ImageNet-C. So here's our ability to account for fMRI responses collected by another lab, Shu and Vaziri Pashkam, where the participants were presented with clear object images. You see that elephant there, high-pass filtered images, and low-pass filtered images. If we try to account for the patterns of human neural responses across all 3 image types concurrently, we see a massive improvement in our ability to predict human cortical responses with the strong blur CNNs. We see an intermediate level of improvement for the weak blur CNNs in comparison to the standard CNNs shown in red. And what's striking is that we can focus on fMRI responses just to individual conditions, and we see improved prediction for the clear condition. And we also see improved performance for the high-pass filtered condition, which in some sense you could think of as out of distribution. So why are these predictions improving for high-pass filtered images? It's because the human visual system finds these images to be more confusable and confusable in a different way than standard CNNs do. And through blur training, we're actually bringing the CNNs into better alignment with how humans tend to process visual information. If we look at our ability to predict monkey neuronal responses, we see an improved ability to predict responses in early visual areas V1 and V2 for the blur-trained CNN shown in blue and purple. And one thing that's striking, the benefit here is not so strong, but it's highly statistically significant. And it's noteworthy because the monkeys are viewing clear object images. So none of the images here are blurry, yet through training CNNs with a mixture of clear and blurry images, we're doing better at predicting neural responses than CNNs trained on clear images only. And we see the same benefit where monkeys were shown thousands of different natural images in this study by Cadena et al. In terms of our ability to predict V1 responses. So that's that there. One thing that is striking about the deviations of CNNs from humans, and some of you may be familiar with this image, is that CNNs tend to be biased towards classifying objects according to their texture rather than their shape. So this is a very, I think, a creative study by Garros and colleagues, where he used style transfer to transfer, say, the texture of one object. Here, this is elephant skin, applied to this content image or source image, the tabby cat, to render these artificially generated, he calls them shape texture Q conflict stimuli. Now, most humans, when they see this, would say their first reaction is, oh, that's a cat. But for CNNs, they're predisposed to classify this with greater confidence as an elephant rather than as a cat. So here we evaluated using the texture Q conflict stimuli that Garros created to see how the standard and blur trained CNNs would perform. And what we see is, a modest shift towards greater shape bias. Greater bias towards shape rather than texture is indicated by value shifting towards 1. Texture bias is shifting towards 0. And for most of the images, we see an advantage for the blur trained CNNs, where there's a major shift towards shape bias for the blur trained CNNs. Now, keep in mind the gray diamonds at the top. That is human level bias, where they classify the objects based on shape versus texture. So we're still a long way from reaching, at least in terms of the behavioral output, that of humans. But it is, I think, a strong step in that direction. Now we can visualize what features in the image tended to be more heavily weighted by the CNNs using a layer-wise relevance propagation, where we take the classification decision and we propagate all the way back to the input layers. And you can see that for these images illustrated here, the textural features that were used for the style transfer, tend to attract the attention of the standard CNNs for their classification response, and they misclassify as a clock, whereas the weak blur CNN, sometimes gets it right, sometimes gets it wrong. In this case of bottle, it hones in on this cap area. And for the strong blur CNNs, it's able to, capture information that we might call, like sort of a little bit more global or possibly more related to shape. Here zoning in, say, on the head shape of the dog and so forth. Again, these are visualizations; they're not explanations per se, but they can be instructive and suggestive. We further evaluated the performance of these networks with ImageNet-C, using the various types of image transformations and degradations that they use there. Here we're illustrating those degradations performed on a what looks like a wolf image, maybe an Arctic wolf. And you can see that for a large number of image manipulations, all those involving blur, and some of these types of blur are not the kinds that they're trained on, such as motion blur and zoom blur are very, very different. Yet you see a benefit for the strong and blur trained CNN shown in purple and blue as compared to the standard CNN shown in red. It does better with certain forms of digital modifications, such as JPEG compression or pixelation, and also does better with a variety of types of noise, as illustrated here. Gaussian noise, impulse noise, shot noise. For the weather manipulations, that's less obvious, and these seem to deviate from having a benefit from blur. But I think for something like 11 out of 19 or so of these image degradations, we see a significant improvement for the blur trained CNNs as compared to standard CNNs. This is going back to the fMRI study we ran in study 1, where humans viewed objects that were clear, presented in pixelated noise or Fourier phase scrambled noise. And again, we see that the blur trained CNNs do better at predicting human cortical responses for all visual areas when we consider all conditions. And again, if we focus on just the cleared conditions, we see a benefit of blur training, and we see much improved performance for the pixelated noise condition. So here, keep in mind that the CNN is not being trained on noise per se, but on blur, and we're doing a better job predicting fMRI responses to out of distribution conditions involving pixelated Gaussian noise and even Fourier phase scrambled noise. So some conclusions: although often misconstrued as a flaw, blur may be a critical property that helps biological and artificial visual systems acquire more robust representations. Blur-trained CNNs are more sensitive to shape information, more robust to noise, and better aligned with the human visual system. And our findings can help inform the development of better DNN models of biological vision and more robust computer vision applications in general. In fact, data augmentation with a combination of clear and blurry images could be just generally useful in a variety of settings. I'd like to thank current and former lab members, a very special shout out to Hojin Jang, who's now an assistant professor at Korea University, and to our sources of funding. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank our speaker. Okay, questions. I have several, so
Sure.
I'm going to use my panelist advantage and ask mine first. So,
Sure.
all these studies are based on neural networks that are trained in a supervised manner, right? So they're trained with cross entropy loss essentially. Um, is the effect of self-supervised learning known for these convolutional neural networks? So how do they behave compared to the human?
That's a great question. So we've worked some with using contrastive learning. We've worked with some of these networks where you do contrastive training with clear images only, or a combination of clear and blurry images. Here we were doing the contrastive training, say, across clear and blurry, and you see a similar benefit or improvement when you do contrastive learning across clear and blurry. Classification accuracy can sometimes suffer a bit for these networks, but you can use methods to try to boost that. Like one trick we used, you can add an extra layers afterwards, but one trick we use is just using a mixture of supervised and contrastive, where let's say contrastive involves comparing clear and blurry, and then you see a boost in robustness. But you can also just do this straight up with just straight contrastive and use a different approaches to improve classification at the end, like say freezing weights or whatnot. And I think that that's really important and useful, because when you look around the world, so say I'm looking at an object and suddenly I turn to look at you, the lens of the eye takes time to accommodate. That means to change shape. So even if ultimately I focus on you and you're clear, if I'm at a different focal distance, let's say far away, and then I zoom in and look at your face, it'll take a fraction of a second for me to see you clearly. And that type of blur that happens, we're not even talking about motion blur, which also happens, could provide an instructive signal for contrastive learning, because one moment in time you're blurry, next you're clear. Your brain can link together those moments of experience and form a representation that sort of glues those together. And so we think that actually is a very likely a useful signal for one component of how we boost robustness.
Fantastic. And I have one more question, right? So CNNs, at least on large data sets, are no longer the state of the art, right? Like we get the VITs these days. So the relationships to the brain is not there for VITs, or at least I'm not aware of this relationship for them. Like what can be done with those networks?
That's a really on target question, and I'm glad you asked that. I'm going to jump to a slide. Let's see if I can bring that up. Oh wait. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So I think this is a supplementary figure in our paper. I don't think it's one of our main ones, but we evaluated VITB, even though, again, it's not clear that VIT networks are biologically plausible in any sense, but it's been purported or asserted that they may be, processing information more globally. You might think of them as possibly processing more shape information or whatnot, because they're the way they process information in those patches and the pairwise combinations of patches and so forth. So we see the same improvements in terms of ability to predict neural responses shown in A, B, and C. Well, actually less evident for C, but for A and B, for predicting neural responses to combinations of clear and blurry images or clear and noisy images for VIT after blur training. We see improvements in terms of performance for ImageNet C, shown in panel E. Sorry for the confusing use of letters there. And also strikingly, in terms of shape bias, VIT networks are not very robust to these texture shape Q conflict stimuli shown in red. They're just as susceptible and biased towards texture, reporting, biased towards texture, 80% of the time, shape 20% of the time. But the blur trained VIT networks are more shape biased, shown in blue and purple. So they show these same effects. Doesn't mean that they're processing the information the way the human visual cortex does, but in terms of the learned representations after this blur training, they too are in somewhat better alignment with the human data.
Got it. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
I have another question. So it's very insightful to compare the human behavior and the model performance in the scenarios of noise and blur. And I'm wondering if we compare the scenario of noise and blur together, whether humans or models have different patterns. For example, you showed one slide related to the heat map, similar to heat map, showing which are the parts that human focus to make the decision, and whether this region would change for humans in the case of noise or blur. I assume that humans would perform consistently to choose the region to make the decision, but not sure whether the models would change.
Yes, so we would need to delve a bit more deeply at an image by image level. From a first pass, it looked like for humans, the regions that they tend to rely as diagnostic for clear, and we haven't looked at it in detail for blur, but for noise, tend to overlap to a good degree, but we don't know, we haven't quantified the extent to which it deviates or shifts as a systematic consequence of adding the noise. And that would be interesting to look at, and then to further compare that with CNN. So there's the how much do CNNs resemble humans? How much do their labeled image regions match? But then there's the how does human performance change going from clear to noisy on an image by image basis, and then to what extent does that shift also reflect? We haven't done that sort of second order or second level analysis, if that's what you mean. But we've done the first order one, which is the easier one. I think to do the second order one well, you wouldn't use all images. You try to handpick, it might seem biased, but you handpick a subset of images that are the best at where you see the strongest changes with the addition of noise. And then you try to figure out what's going on there. And then you start comparing humans and CNNs, maybe. Yeah. That requires more in-depth analysis and thought. What we did was, to be honest, it was a little bit like a CS thing. We did sort of just straightforward number crunching. But when you start analyzing on an image by image basis, that gets more time consuming. But I think it can also potentially be more thoughtful and lead to deeper insights.
Just a quick follow-up. So if there are some ways to make sure the model heat map and the human focus are aligned, can that be promising to the final alignment?
I think it can. I mean, as I mentioned, and as we saw, the alignment is improved for the noise-trained CNNs, but there's still a huge gap between human to human similarity and CNN to human similarity. And to be honest, even with the blur-trained CNNs, I'm not convinced that CNNs really see shape information at all like we do. I mean, you have a bunch of, linear filters and some pooling, and then, you have ReLU, and it's pulling together more and more things, but that's a little bit different from processing shape per se. And you could even talk about mathematical descriptions of shape or human descriptions, self-reported descriptions. Our reliance on the word shape is surprisingly underspecified, I think, as a concept, and that's why I think it's intriguing. But one thing that people who study the human visual system commented on CNNs, and maybe you'd have to also look at CNNs trained concurrently on, segmentation and classification concurrently. Maybe that would be interesting. But that the CNNs do surprisingly well, even though they aren't explicitly segmenting the scene. Whereas we probably, most of the time rely on segmentation and identification either sequentially or perhaps concurrently. We're doing both at the same time. And segmentation, like you have an advantage here because my background is blurry due to Zoom, not due to bad camera. But segmentation certainly helps with object identification. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So one more question, and this is I actually attended the keynote speech by James DiCarlo in CVPR 2017, where he was talking about the correlation between the diffusion matrix of humans and diffusion matrices of monkeys and or CNNs. And so there he talked about if humans have limited amount of time to make decision, so I just see something, I don't remember the numbers, but let's say under 50 milliseconds, right? The correlation between the confusion matrices of humans, monkeys, and CNNs were very high. But when they increase the amount of time, so something happens. I mean, of course, CNNs don't have time, but like humans and monkeys start doing much better than CNNs. So that kind of stuck with me over the years, and I'm still like curious to understand like how can we bring in both the forward and the top down that you had in the beginning, and whether this will allow us to analyze shape and texture. The bottom up is going to be more texture oriented, but the top down should be more shape oriented. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first off, I believe that that's true, and not through our CNN work, but through our fMRI work, we see evidence of all kinds of top-down processing in the visual system, including like if you're holding something in visual working memory, we can read that out from V1, even though you're not looking at anything. So top-down activity goes all the way back to V1 and alters the patterns of activity that happen there. I totally agree with Jim. Just a brief mention, he had a follow-up study after that 2017 talk where he looked at easier and harder to recognize object images in the monkey, and he found that the harder to recognize object images are better discriminated later in time from neuronal responses in IT cortex, and that he can, work with recurrent neural network models that have a time component and see effects that seem consistent with that later time evolution. There's also human work that has worked with recurrent neural networks that tries to link duration of processing or certain time points of neural processing to different time points of processing with the recurrent neural networks. We have been playing with various recurrent neural networks, but it's still early stages with us. We can see that they do better than a standard network that doesn't have recurrence. But at least in our hands, when we've compared a recurrent neural network to a deeper network that has the same number of nonlinear operations, we haven't seen dramatic differences there as strong as other research groups have claimed. Now, that doesn't mean recurrence isn't important in the brain. I mean, at the very least, it's giving us probably additional nonlinear operations that get to happen in our cortex, even though we have a finite number of visual areas. But we haven't gotten that working. And it could well exist, and I'm just not aware of it, but I haven't seen implementations of top-down feedback in a CNN-like architecture that has totally bowled me over. But there are interesting developments. Like there are predictive coding networks that do interesting things, and again, we're just starting to look into it. There's some early papers showing that, say, predictive coding networks trained on, say, predicting movie video data show some interesting properties and things like that. Again, we've looked a little bit deeper, but not deep enough into it, and we see some benefit, but it's not as dramatic as we would like to see. And so we're still working on how to think about these problems better.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm really interested in this, so I'll definitely get in touch offline to talk about this. And this interchangeability of recurrence and depth is also something that we have looked at it in our lab. Like deeper networks, you can think about like they're approximating a recurrent model essentially, right? But so like a truly they don't capture the truly top-down concept that we're talking about. I think like so there's a lot of interesting research questions that one can ask here. So sorry, we are 3 minutes over, but I really enjoyed this talk, Frank. I really appreciate your time. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. You can look me up, just frank.tong@vanderbilt.edu. And thanks again. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good one. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.